The Minnesota Wild have a big game coming up on Monday as they seek to end a 3-game losing streak. But what's ahead in the second half for the Wild? Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild joins us to discuss that and what the Wild may do at the trade deadline. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice for Locked On NHL fans, Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild. And Seth, a little bump in the road here for the Wild. They've lost 3 straight. They lose a fight-filled game over the weekend. What's been causing their struggles as of late?
Well, thankfully, I can pretty much succinctly pin it down on one thing, that being the injuries. And that was a big reason that the game against the Predators was filled with as many fights as it was, is because Zach LaRue double slew-footed, not just a single slew-foot, a double slew-foot that knocked Jared Spurgeon out of the lineup. And so obviously the Wild have been frustrated about that for a long time. It's the injuries. I mean, I challenge any other team in the league to take a Hart Trophy contender and your top 3 defensemen out of the lineup and continue to win at the pace that you have been throughout the start of the season. So it's been rough, and it's not only those guys, but the Wild at one point this year were without Kirill Kaprizov, Jake Middleton, who's in the midst of a career year defensively and offensively, Brock Faber, Jared Spurgeon, Jonas Brodin. Like they are just a mash unit at this point in the season. And the hope is that this team has done enough, especially early on in the season, to keep themselves in a playoff spot until these players come back, and that they'll be able to get back to maybe not that same level of winning at the beginning of the year, but something similar to that. Because they were, before the injuries started to hit, they were one of the best teams in the NHL, and it's not just like, at some point you just have to dismiss it as a fluke. Once they get those guys back, they're hoping to get to that same level again.
What's the timetable?
So Brock Faber returned to the lineup against Nashville. So that's a huge sigh of relief. And Jake Middleton missed about 3 weeks. He has come back within the last few games as well. It sounds like Kirill Kaprizov and Jared Spurgeon are very close. They practiced fully on Friday, but just did not make the trip. I think the team is trying to be overly cautious with bringing these guys back just to make sure it hasn't been officially speculated, but I think we all pretty much know it's a groin injury for Kaprizov. Those can be pesky. So they're trying to be overly cautious to make sure that they don't rush him back. For Jared Spurgeon, I think when the injury initially happened, the fear was that he was going to be gone for the year because it looked ugly. But he practiced fully. By all accounts, he looks great. So I think hopefully by the end of the week, we should have those 2 guys back. And unfortunately, on the Jonas Brodin side of things, hasn't begun skating yet. He blocked a shot at the end of the game against the St. Louis Blues after he played like 33 minutes in that game and was just like one of the better games he's ever had. And then he blocks a shot with his foot and he's out of the lineup. So that's just the luck that the Wild have this year. But it sounds like they'll get at least 2 of those guys back. And then at that point, they got Jakub Lauko back, who's been out of the lineup as well for quite a bit. Maybe not as notable of a piece as the others, but still he brings a physical presence in the bottom 6 that's been missing. So once they get all those guys back, it'll pretty much just be Brodin that is still out of the lineup, and then they can kind of try to get everybody back to where they've been, and just try to kind of get the car going back nice and steady on the road again.
You know, the Wild have been very strong 5-on-5, but special teams, not so great. Talk to me about the struggles on special teams.
Well, it seems, thankfully, like the power play is starting to get a little bit of a pulse again. Matt Boldy scored a power play goal against the Predators, even though the Wild lost that game. And even though they have lost some of these recent games, the power play has done a much better job of being more of a consistent threat, which it always sounds weird to say this, but I think there is something to it. I think with Kirill out of the lineup, it forces the rest of the lineup to see who's going to step up. So I think having that opportunity to have other players step into that top role on that power play unit, I think has helped lead to more options that can score. I think sometimes this team, when Kirill's in the lineup, they just, we don't want to get in the way. We want to let Kirill do his thing, and we don't want to take opportunities away from him, which I totally get. But at the same time, if you've got the puck, let it rip, let it fly. On the penalty kill side, I don't even know at this point. Like, it's been bad for probably 4 years. It was covered up a couple of seasons. One, the year a couple years ago where Philip Gustafsson was a Vezina candidate, he really covered up this penalty kill by simply making saves. It comes down to not winning faceoffs on the kill, which leads to the other team being able to get set up in the zone. I think if you can win those initial faceoffs and send it back down, you force the other team to have to play from behind the whole time. There hasn't been consistent faceoff wins. The Wild haven't consistently pressed teams on the kill either. They kind of sit back and just wait for teams to shoot. And rebound control around the net, both by the defense and the forwards and the goalies, has not been great too. So you combine all of those things, and if it was just one of those factors that was an issue, you can work with that. But it seems like the fact that all of those have been major problems is just, it's like a leaky pipe where you've got a couple of spots that are leaking water. If you had just one, you could patch that up pretty well and you'd be fine. But the fact that there are 4 different spots that are consistently leaking, you plug 2, the other 2 are still going to give up the water. So it's one of those where it has been different schemes. They've had different personnel on those units. At the end of the day, I think you just need to go in with an understanding if we just got to go full out for these 2 minutes every time we're on the kill to make sure that the other team doesn't score.
Trade deadline is now about 6 weeks away, but of course there's that break in the middle for the Four Nations tournament. It's a competitive division right now. The Wild could finish anywhere in the top 4, more or less. What do you think their approach will be at the trade deadline?
Well, I think there are a couple of areas that the Wild could use an upgrade. Number one is second line. That wing spot has been a little bit of a black hole for the last couple of seasons, and there have been links to players such as Brock Besser, obviously the Minnesota tie, and your guy, Gil, Brock Nelson, has been linked to the Minnesota Wild here for the last few weeks. So I think if they can find a way, you're going to need to have somebody broker, like, take most of that salary on. So if, let's just say Brock Nelson, for example, prorated, I think he's making $6 million this year. So if you prorate it to like 4 for the rest of the season or whatever it ends up being, you might have to find a team to take on 60-75% of that salary. And then the Wild could take on the rest. And you plug somebody in like that on that second line. I think that really helps them out. The other spot that I'd like to see too is maybe a defenseman, maybe one defenseman to come in kind of on the cheap, but somebody who has NHL experience and can fill in more of like a little bit higher than a third line role that could play, second pairing, maybe could fill in on the top pairing depending on injuries. I that's something that I have thought about over the last couple of weeks, especially, is if the Wild can get just a little bit of defense insurance, I think that would be good to explore too. But I get the sense with Kirill Kaprizov entering the final year of his deal next year, with how well this team started the season, that Bill Guerin is really looking to make a trade here if he can. Last year, we saw the Wild kind of broker some deals because they had a ton of space at the deadline. This year, they do not. So now you're going to have to. He's just going to have to get somebody else to help out and do a solid. And the Wild have plenty of picks, plenty of prospects in the system that they could certainly dangle those to make all that happen.
All right. Well, Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can follow the show at Locked On Wild on all of your favorite social platforms, X, Instagram, Facebook. I think TikTok is back now, so you can go on TikTok too. So you can follow us all there. And of course, myself, you can follow at Seth, Toups. Pretty much all things sports and otherwise, if you want my opinions there, make sure to check me out on those platforms as well.
All right, Seth, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by SelectQuote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Stanley Cup. The same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. What sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. If you're in good health, you might even qualify for same-day coverage of up to $5 million. No medical exam required, and it's more affordable than you think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at SelectQuote.com/LockedOnNHL. Go to SelectQuote.com/LockedOnNHL today to get started. That's SelectQuote.com/LockedOnNHL. SelectQuote, they shop, you save.